200 guests filled the house on the hill that Saturday night, and every one of them was there to celebrate the engagement of the most powerful man in Providence. The woman in the catering uniform wasn't a guest. She was 27. She'd been awake since 4 that morning, and she was carrying a tray toward the kitchen the way she'd carried 1,000 others. Eyes down, saying nothing, hoping nobody would notice her at all. Then a glass tipped over near the head table. Wine caught the hem of the future bride's dress, and the woman in the flawless gown turned around looking for someone to blame. She found the one person in that room she was certain couldn't fight back. She demanded an apology. The delivery woman told her, quietly, that she hadn't touched her. She demanded it again, louder, so the whole room could hear. And when the answer still didn't change, she picked up a full glass of red and threw it in the delivery woman's face. Nobody breathed. 200 people watched wine run down a faded work coat, and every single one of them waited for the girl to break, apologize, and disappear out the service door, because that's what they'd all seen happen before. She didn't. She set her tray down carefully so nothing would spill, wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, and what she did next was something nobody in that room would ever forget. If this story reaches you somewhere along the way, take a second to like it and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so the next story finds you too. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's go back to that Saturday evening in Providence, to the house on the hill, and to the moment that glass left her hand. The wine was still running slowly down her collar, soaking into the faded fabric worn thin at the elbows. And in that moment, Adeline Marsh didn't think of herself. She thought of the tray. The small plates she hadn't yet had time to carry back to the kitchen were still on it, and if she let go in anger, the thing that shattered wouldn't be Camilla Sinclair's wineglass, but someone else's belongings, someone else's work, and in the end, it would still be blamed on her. So she bent down, set the tray neatly on the edge of the side table, adjusted it until it was balanced, and only then straightened up. She swept the back of her hand across her cheek. The wine clinging to her eyelashes forced her to blink several times before she could clearly see the woman standing in front of her. And when she could see her clearly, she spoke in a voice no louder than the one she used when reading the list of dishes in the kitchen. "My dress will dry. What you just threw away won't." The entire hall went still. It wasn't the silence of people waiting to see what would happen next, but the silence of 200 people who had all realized at once that they didn't understand what was happening. A waiter standing nearby forgot about the bottle of wine tilted in his hand. In the corner of the room, the violin stopped in the middle of a measure, though no one had told the musician to stop. Camilla Sinclair blinked. Never in her life had anyone answered her in that voice. The voice of someone who wasn't trembling, wasn't angry, and wasn't asking for anything. "What did you just say?" Adeline didn't repeat herself. She simply looked straight into the woman's eyes and added one more sentence, still speaking as slowly as before. "You can make me leave tonight, but everyone in this room has just seen who you are, and that can't be washed away." Somewhere among the tables behind them came the faint sound of a teacup touching its saucer, as though the person setting it down were doing everything he could not to make a sound. It was a silver-haired old man, seated with several other elderly guests, a man who had been coming to this house since the former owner was still alive. He set down his cup, removed his glasses, and didn't put them back on. Camilla opened her mouth to continue, but no words came out. Her face flushed red, then turned pale again, and the hand still holding the empty glass tightened slightly. In a shadowed corner behind one of the columns, a middle-aged man in a dark suit remained motionless with a glass of water in his hand. He didn't take a single step forward or say a single word. He merely watched the young woman in the delivery uniform with the gaze of someone committing a face to memory. No one noticed him. They were too busy looking elsewhere. Adeline lowered her eyes. Shards of broken glass lay scattered across the stone floor beneath her feet, some of them having flown as far as the head table. She knelt on one knee, picked up the larger pieces one by one, placed them in her palm, then used a napkin to gather the smaller fragments. Someone in the crowd stirred faintly, as though about to tell her to stand up, as though about to say that someone else would take care of it. But in the end, no one said anything. She did it with perfect composure, exactly as she'd done for so many years in so many different kitchens, and that quiet composure unsettled them more deeply than any scream could have. When she'd finished, she rose, wrapped the broken pieces securely in the napkin so no one would cut a hand while taking out the trash, then told the nearest waiter that the floor was still wet and asked him to wipe it again so no one would slip. Then she picked up the tray. One shoulder of her dress was still stained, dark with wine, and her hair clung damply to her temple, but she walked through those 200 people without lowering her head or lifting it high. She simply walked straight ahead at an even pace, as though this were any other Saturday night. The service door closed softly behind her, and inside the great hall, it was a long while before anyone remembered that they needed to start talking again. The corridor leading to the service entrance was narrow and flooded with white light. Nothing like the warm, golden glow inside the great hall. And Adeline had gone no more than a dozen steps when someone moved out and blocked her path. She stopped. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his overcoat still on as though he'd just come in from outside, and she recognized him immediately even though she'd never seen him in person. There was only one man in this house who could stand in the middle of a corridor without anyone trying to pass him. Angelo Ferrante didn't look at the wine staining her dress. He looked straight into her eyes, and the first thing he said wasn't an apology. "What company do you work for?" Adeline gave him the name of the catering company. He gave one brief nod, then reached into the inner pocket of his coat and took out a small notebook and a pen. He wrote without resting the notebook on anything, holding it against his own palm, his movements swift and decisive. Like a man who'd done this so many times, he no longer had to think about it. Then he tore out the paper and held it toward her. "What happened tonight ends here," he said, his voice low and even, carrying neither the air of someone granting a favor nor the slightest trace of remorse. "You take this. You don't tell anyone, you don't post it anywhere, and you don't speak to anyone who calls asking questions. Tomorrow morning, your company will receive additional contracts. You go home, and we forget all of this." Adeline looked at the check. The number written on it was greater than everything she could earn in an entire season of working 3 jobs combined. It was more than the debt hanging over her head, so much more that for one fleeting second, she could see an entire month in which she wouldn't have to wake at 4 o'clock in the morning. Then she looked up. "You didn't ask whether I was all right," she said. "You didn't ask who was right or who was wrong." Angelo didn't blink. "I don't need to know who was right. I need this not to leave my house." "Then, what exactly are you paying for?" He was silent for half a beat. No one in that house ever asked him a second question. "For your inconvenience," he answered. Adeline raised her hand, but instead of taking the check, she placed 2 fingers against its edge and gently pushed it back, forcing him to catch it before it dropped to the floor. "You can pay to have my dress cleaned," she said, "but the face that had wine thrown at it in front of 200 people isn't for sale. Keep it." A silence settled over the corridor in which they could both clearly hear the music drifting from the great hall beyond the wall. Angelo Ferrante stood there with the paper in his hand, and in the 4 years he'd carried the weight of that entire name on his shoulders. This was the first time anyone beneath his roof had refused his money, and refused it with such perfect composure. He folded the paper in half, then folded it again into quarters, and said nothing more about it. "What's your name?" Adeline looked at him for a long moment before answering. Then she gave her surname first and her given name second, separating each word and speaking slowly, like someone setting something very heavy on a table before pulling her hands away to see whether it would fall. "Marsh," she said. "Adeline Marsh." At the other end of the corridor came the sound of glass striking glass, followed by metal crashing onto the stone floor. The elderly butler was approaching with a tray of ice water, and the tray had slipped from his hands. Water spread across the floor. Several glasses rolled toward the wall, and one shattered. He stood frozen where he was. He didn't bend down to pick anything up or offer an apology. His hands remained in the position of holding the tray even though there was nothing left in them. Angelo turned his head. Adeline turned as well. The old butler blinked several times, then bent down unsteadily as a waiter rushed over to support him. No one said a word. Adeline turned back to Angelo, gave him the faintest nod of farewell, then continued toward the door at the end of the corridor. He didn't call her back. He stood there, watching the back of her faded delivery uniform, one shoulder dark and wet with wine, while inside his coat pocket, the paper folded into quarters remained untouched. The name she'd just laid down in the middle of that corridor had once appeared on the front page of the local newspaper. During the winter, when she was still so small, she had to stand on tiptoe to reach the doorknob. There was a thin layer of snow that morning. Her father was tying his necktie in front of the mirror when someone knocked on the door. He went to answer it, then turned back toward his 2 children in the kitchen and told them, in the most ordinary voice in the world, that he had to go out for a little while and they should finish their bread before it grew cold. He walked out the door with several men in heavy coats. He never came back. Thomas Marsh was an accountant for a large construction company in the city, and in the bold headlines that ran for days afterward, they called him the man who'd stolen money from the very workers whose accounts he'd been hired to keep. They even printed a photograph of him standing in front of the company building, taken when he'd first started working there and was still smiling. The neighbors stopped greeting her mother at the market. Their little house with the blue painted wooden porch was taken from them before the trial was even over. Then everything fell apart so quickly that Adeline was never able to put the events back into their proper order afterward. She only remembered one day when her mother sat for a very long time on the edge of the bed with both hands covering her face, and how, not long after that, her younger brother was adopted by a family in a coastal town and grew up there. People said it was the best thing that could be done at the time. Her mother signed the papers, then took 3 jobs at once, and she never spoke of it again, not even once. Her father died while he was still waiting for his appeal to be reviewed. Adeline received the news in a telephone call in the middle of the afternoon while she was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework. From that day forward, there were only 2 women left in the house. She did well in school, well enough for them to call her name at the graduation ceremony and award her a scholarship. But she'd made it only halfway through her studies when her mother became ill, so she closed her books and came home. Her mother remained in the hospital longer than anyone had expected. When she died, what she left her daughter was a box of photographs, a tarnished silver necklace, and a stack of hospital bills that Adeline was still paying off month by month even now. There was one other thing, an ivory envelope that had yellowed with age, sealed and never opened, with the faint image of a lighthouse impressed into one corner, so small that it could only be seen when tilted toward the light. Her mother gave it to her on one of her final nights, when she could no longer sit up, and she held her daughter's hand very tightly as she spoke. "Don't open it. I never did. But if the day ever comes when you're standing inside that house and someone tries to make you feel small, then you may." Adeline asked which house she meant. Her mother only smiled, and her answer was the last thing she ever said about it. "You'll know which house it is. I only hope you never have to set foot inside it for as long as you live." For all the years that followed, Adeline did whatever work people were willing to hire her to do. She started at the bakery at 4 o'clock in the morning, spent her days making deliveries, and worked catered events on weekends. She lived in a room above the laundromat on Elmwood Street, slept 4 hours a night, and never told anyone whose daughter she was. Then came the week when the catering company received a contract for an engagement celebration at the house on the hill. The work schedule was posted on the kitchen wall, and Adeline stood before that sheet of paper for a long time, reading the address twice, and both times her hands turned cold. Then she went to find the manager and asked to change shifts. She said she needed the extra hours. It was the first time in her life she'd ever asked for a particular shift. 7 days after the party, everything closed around her with quiet precision. The bakery called to say they were cutting staff. The delivery company told her that her temporary contract had expired, and no, they didn't have any plans to renew it. The catering company said a guest had complained, but no one would tell her which guest it was. Her landlord knocked on her door to inform her that her rent would increase by half at the beginning of the month, and on Friday morning, her old car was towed away over a parking violation so old that no one had ever mentioned it before. That afternoon, Adeline sat on the steps outside the laundromat, with 2 cloth bags beside her, still holding the landlord's notice in one hand. She remained there for a very long time without crying, simply staring down at the street and waiting until she could think of what she was supposed to do next. That same afternoon, about a 20-minute drive from the laundromat, a man was kneeling on the carpet inside the study on the 2nd floor of the house on the hill. His name was DeLucci. He'd worked as a subcontractor on Ferrante family construction sites since the former owner was still alive, and he'd taken the material funds from 2 projects and used the money to settle a debt at a place no decent man should ever enter. Now his creditors had come looking for him, and he had nowhere left to go but this room. He spoke very quickly, stumbling over his words as he talked about his grandchild, the house in his wife's name, and how he swore on his life that if he could have just one more season, he would find a way to make everything right. Angelo Ferrante sat behind his desk and listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt him once, didn't drum his fingers against the wood, and didn't look at the clock. When the man had finished speaking and could do nothing but breathe, Angelo stood, walked to the small table against the wall, poured a glass of water, carried it back, and placed it before him. Then he sat on the edge of the desk, bringing himself level with the eyes of the man kneeling on the floor, and spoke in the low voice that could only be heard when everyone else had fallen completely silent. You don't have to repay that money anymore. I'm erasing the debt. Go home, have dinner with your wife, and get a peaceful night's sleep. The man looked up, his face twisting with disbelief. Angelo waited until he'd had time to feel relieved, then continued in the same quiet voice. But beginning tomorrow morning, there won't be a construction site anywhere in this state that will hire you. I don't mean none of my sites. I mean none of them. I won't need to call anyone. I'll simply say nothing when people ask me about you. Do you understand? The man sank onto the carpet. He lifted the glass with both hands, because one hand alone was trembling too badly, took a drink, then thanked him. He thanked him again when he stood, and a third time as he backed toward the door. Angelo didn't respond. He simply watched the door close, then returned to his desk, where a file had been lying since morning without once being opened. It was the draft of a merger agreement between the Fiancée Group and the Sinclair family's real estate corporation, and on the final page, beneath the space reserved for signatures, there was a small note stating that the two families would be joined by marriage within the same quarter. 2 nights earlier, in the basement of a restaurant on Atwell's Avenue, the Council of Families had gathered and told him something he'd already known for a long time. The docks on Allen's Avenue were the only thing still keeping the Fiancée name level with the other names in this city, and those docks were losing money. The Ardolino family had offered to buy them 3 times. If Angelo wanted to keep them, he needed the Sinclair family's capital, and the Sinclairs didn't invest money in a name. They invested only in a family. The man seated at the head of the table, an old man who'd occupied that place since Angelo's father was still alive, told him that the council was giving him until the end of the season. Complete the merger, or withdraw from Federal Hill and allow someone else to manage the docks. No one raised his voice. No one struck the table. They simply gave him the date, poured more wine, and moved on to another subject. The following morning, on his way down to the docks, his car was blocked by 2 other vehicles on the sloping road. 2 men from the Ardolino family stepped out, and Angelo opened his door and emerged alone, bringing no one with him. He spoke with them for several minutes. No one raised his voice, and no one touched anyone. Then the 2 men returned to their cars and drove away. More than 400 people were working on the docks that day. People who'd been there since their father's generation. People whose faces Angelo knew, whose wives and children he knew by name, people whose heart surgeries and weddings he knew about. Angelo stood on the road and watched them for a long time. Then he returned home. And that evening, he called Camilla Sinclair to discuss the date of their engagement ceremony. He didn't love her. She knew he didn't love her. But that contract required 2 signatures, and one of those signatures represented 400 jobs. 3 days after Adeline sat on the steps with the 2 cloth bags beside her, someone knocked on the door of her room above the laundromat. She opened it and found the elderly butler from the house on the hill standing there, holding his hat in his hands and breathing a little heavily from the stairs. He apologized for arriving without notice. He said his name was Bruno Tedesco, and that he'd had to ask at 3 different places before finding this address. Adeline invited him inside. The room contained only a small table beside the window and 2 chairs. He sat in one of them, placed his hat on his lap, and remained silent for a long while. Then he took a napkin, folded into quarters from his pocket, and asked to borrow her pen. He began to draw. His old hand trembled, so the lines weren't straight, but he drew slowly and steadily, like a man who'd traced that image in his mind many times before. A narrow tower with a flared base, and at the top, a circle of light radiating outward in several short beams. He pushed the napkin across the table. "This," he said. "Have you ever seen it anywhere before?" Adeline looked at the drawing. Then she stood, walked to the box containing her mother's photographs, and took out the ivory envelope. She placed it on the table beside the napkin. In its upper left corner, visible when tilted toward the light, was that exact tower, surrounded by that exact circle of light. Bruno Tedesco stared at it for a very long time without reaching out to touch it. Then he spoke, his voice suddenly hoarse. "The former owner gave me an instruction before I ever had a gray hair. He said that if the day ever came when someone bearing the name Marsh entered that house, I wasn't to ask why they'd come. I was to call him immediately, whether it was day or night. He told me once, and he never mentioned it again. Then he died. I thought I would carry that instruction to my grave." He raised his eyes to her. "That Saturday night, When you said your name in the corridor, I dropped the tray of water. Angelo Ferrante arrived that evening. He came alone, driving himself, parked on the street, and climbed the narrow wooden staircase along the side of the laundromat. He sat in the second chair inside that little room without saying a word about how small it was. Adeline placed the envelope in the center of the table. She told the two men about one of her mother's final nights in the hospital, about the way her mother had held her hand, and about the instruction not to open the envelope unless the day came when she stood inside that house and someone tried to make her feel small. Bruno lowered his head when he heard that. Angelo said nothing. Adeline picked up the letter opener, slid it beneath the edge of the envelope, and cut it open. The adhesive had hardened over the years, so she had to pull twice before it gave way, and the sound of the old paper opening seemed very faint in the silence of that room. There were only two things inside. The first was a faded photocopy of a construction site's payroll sheet, printed in ink that had turned brown with age, with the company name at the top and a list of workers arranged alphabetically beneath it. Near the middle of the page, 2 lines had been overwritten in a different ink. The original numbers were still faintly visible underneath. The second was a small piece of paper, no larger than the palm of a hand, covered in slanted, forceful handwriting, the hand of someone who wrote quickly, but was never careless. Adeline read it aloud, and her voice slowed over the final words. The person who took that money is still sitting at my table. No one spoke for a very long time. Bruno Tedesco raised a hand to his mouth. Angelo picked up the note and studied the handwriting, and his entire body stiffened so slightly that only the person sitting across from him could have noticed. He knew that handwriting. He'd looked at it throughout his childhood, on birthday cards, and on notes left on the kitchen table. "This is my father's handwriting," he said. Then he turned the paper over. The back was blank. He placed it gently on the table, as though it might shatter. Outside the window, the streetlights had just come on. "This envelope," he asked. "Where did your mother get it?" Adeline shook her head. "My mother never told me." Bruno Tedesco remained silent for a long time after that question, both hands resting on the brim of his hat, before saying there was something in the house he'd never told anyone about, not even the young master. The following night, the 3 of them stood inside the old study on the 2nd floor, facing the antique safe against the wall. No one had bothered to open it since the former owner died because it held nothing but property deeds and several outdated ledgers. Bruno turned the dial. He did it slowly, stopping once because he'd forgotten the combination, then remembering it again. The safe door sprang open with a dry click. At the very bottom, beneath the thick folders, was a brown cardboard box tied with string, about the size of a shoebox. A yellowed paper label on its lid bore the name of a prison in the northern part of the state. Bruno lifted it out with both hands and set it on the table. "It arrived here before my hair turned gray," he said. "The sender was a chaplain at the prison. He included a few lines with it, and I still remember the general meaning. He said this man had given the letters to him for safekeeping, because there was no address where they could be sent. His wife and children had moved several times, and the letters had been returned several times, so eventually he simply kept writing them and gave them to the chaplain to hold. When he died, the records didn't contain the name of any relative they could locate, so the chaplain sent the entire box to the last place where he'd worked." Bruno paused. "It was here, Ferrante Construction." Adeline didn't reach for it. She stared at the box on the wooden table, at the string worn nearly through around the knot, and she heard herself ask in a voice that sounded very strange whether the former owner had known what was inside. Bruno nodded. "He opened it once. I was standing exactly where you're standing now. He read a few pages, then tied it closed again, put it in the safe, and locked the door. He didn't say a word to me, but he didn't come down for dinner that night." Angelo cut the string with a small knife. The box was filled with envelopes arranged upright, their folded edges facing upward, as neatly as books on a shelf. There were dozens of them. Not one bore a stamp. The same line was written across the front of every envelope in the same handwriting, some in blue ink and some in pencil. To Rosalind, Adeline, and Owen. Adeline removed the envelope at the top, then she put it down, turned the box upside down in her mind, and understood that the one on top was the oldest. So she reached all the way to the bottom and pulled out the final envelope. A date was written in the upper corner. It was 3 days before the afternoon when she'd been sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework, and the telephone rang. She opened it. The paper was thin and lined, the kind sold in the prison commissary. The handwriting was smaller than it was on the envelopes above it and spaced farther apart, as though the writer had been forced to stop and rest several times. She read it aloud because Bruno was in his 70s, and his eyes could no longer make out such small writing, and because she thought that if she didn't read it aloud, she wouldn't be able to read it at all. My Addie, you're 8 years old this year. I've sat here counting it over and over before I could be sure, because every day in here is the same, and it's easy to lose track. I don't know if you still remember my face. If you don't, that's all right, sweetheart. You were so young. Let me tell you a few things, and then you can put this letter away. Remember to go to bed early. Don't stay up too late studying. When you wake in the morning, remember to eat something before you leave. Be good to your mother. She has a hard life. And don't worry about your brother. He's in a good place, and when you're both grown, you'll find each other again. If anyone tells you that your father is a thief, don't argue with them. Arguing only wears you out, my child, and no one will believe you anyway. You only need to live a decent life, so that one day people will see for themselves that they were wrong. I believe that day will come. I don't know whether I'll live long enough to see it, but you will. I love you more than I can say. Adeline finished reading. Then she folded the paper along its original creases, slowly and carefully, as though folding it the wrong way might ruin something that could never be repaired. She placed it on the table. No one in that room said a word. Bruno Tedesco turned his face toward the window. Angelo Ferrante stood motionless, his arms hanging at his sides, staring at the cardboard box on the table in his own house as though it were something that had just been dug up from beneath the floor. The name that had been altered on the payroll sheet led them to a second-hand shop in Pawtucket, where the woman who'd once handled payroll for that construction site now sold chipped cups and broken clocks. The shop was narrow and packed with things all the way to the ceiling, and an old cat with faded yellow fur slept among a pile of receipts on the wooden counter, its tail hanging over the edge. Loretta Nash was wiping a plate. She looked up when the bell over the door rang, and she stared at Adeline for about 3 seconds before setting the plate down very slowly. "You're Rosalind's daughter," she said. It wasn't a question. Adeline stood frozen in the narrow aisle. Loretta came around the counter, lifted both hands, then lowered them again, as though she didn't know whether she was allowed to touch the young woman. "You look like your mother right here between the eyebrows," she said. She used to frown that same way whenever she was worried about something she wouldn't talk about. She shooed the cat aside to make room, called it Biscuit, and told it to lie somewhere else. Then she told them the story, briefly, in the voice of someone who'd repeated it inside her own mind far too many times. There had been a fund for worker safety at the construction site, money for new scaffolding, inspections, and insurance for the laborers. That fund had been drained little by little over many months through a supplier Loretta had never seen deliver a single piece of material. Then 3 workers were injured, and none of those 3 men had ever been able to return to work. She stopped there and said nothing more about what had happened that day. "Your father discovered it," she said. "He came to me first. I told him not to touch it. He told me that if he didn't, then who would?" She went into the back room, and when she returned, she was carrying a shoebox secured with a rubber band. Inside were copies, monthly payroll sheets, payment vouchers, warehouse receipts, all of them her own copies, each marked with the date by the rubber stamp she'd used back then. "I kept them," she said, "not because I was brave. I kept them because I was afraid." Then year after year passed, and no one came asking, and I began to think I would die before the day someone walked through the door of this shop. Angelo went through the papers in the shoebox one by one and said nothing for a long while. Adeline was looking toward the shelf against the wall, where a stack of old photograph albums was being sold by weight. Loretta noticed her gaze and said those belonged to her and weren't for sale. She pulled out an album with a peeling leather cover, opened it, and turned several pages. Then she began turning them more slowly, before finally stopping altogether. "This," she said, "was the company Christmas party. They held it at the owner's house every year. In the photograph, people stood in several rows before the Christmas tree in the great hall, the men wearing neckties and the women holding glasses, everyone smiling toward the camera. At the very back, near the edge of the picture and almost hidden by the doorframe, a woman in the gray uniform of a housekeeper was walking past with a cleaning cloth in her hand and had accidentally been caught in the frame. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking down at the floor. Adeline held the album in both hands and said nothing for so long that Loretta had to call her name. Then she raised one finger and touched the glass over the photograph, directly above that tiny face, and spoke in a voice so quiet that the others had to lean closer to hear her. "This is my mother." Loretta sat down on the stool behind the counter. She said that after Thomas went to prison, Rosalind had come looking for her and asked a question Loretta had never forgotten. She asked who kept the records inside that house. I told her she was out of her mind. She only said that the entire city believed her husband was a thief, while the papers proving otherwise were inside someone else's house. Rosalind applied for work there as a housekeeper under her maiden name. She scrubbed floors, washed table linens, cleaned rooms, and every night she stayed a little later than everyone else. She went from room to room, opened every drawer, and searched for a piece of paper whose appearance she didn't even know. She did that for 2 years. Adeline sat down on the shop floor among the boxes of second-hand goods, the album still open across her lap. Angelo stepped toward her, but she raised one hand, not to push him away, only to stop him from saying anything. "My mother scrubbed the floor where I just had wine thrown in my face," she said. The old cat jumped down from the counter, walked past her feet, then lay beside her. Before they left, Loretta Nash took a cloth-bound notebook from the drawer beneath the counter, the one in which she'd written small notes back when she handled payroll, and turned to a page holding a scrap of paper that had nearly crumbled with age. Written on it were the names of a married couple in a coastal town, and a note in Loretta's own handwriting, saying that she'd asked on Rosalind's behalf which family had taken the child home. "She asked me to keep this in case she couldn't hold on to it herself," Loretta said. She was afraid there might come a day when she would forget. It took another 4 days to trace the name he used now. The family had given the boy their surname, and he'd grown up there, attended school there, then moved to the city to learn a trade. Owen Pryor worked as an emergency medical technician at a station in Providence, on the night shift. Adeline waited in the parking lot behind the station at dawn, just as his shift was ending. She'd rehearsed what she would say in her mind a dozen times on the way there, but when the door opened and a young man in a reflective jacket stepped outside with a cup of coffee still in his hand, every word vanished from her mind. He looked at her, then glanced around to see whether she might be waiting for someone else. She said his name. Then she gave him her own, including her surname. Owen stood still. He placed the coffee cup on the lid of the trash can beside the door, moving very slowly, like someone trying to give his hands something to do. "They told me," he said. "When I was in my teens, my parents said I had a birth mother and an older sister. When I asked more questions, they said they didn't know anything else." He looked down at his feet. "I don't remember you. I'm sorry. I've tried to remember, but there's nothing there." Adeline nodded. She told him it was all right, that he'd been far too young and no one could remember being that age. As she spoke, she felt her voice break in the middle of the sentence. Owen was quiet for a moment, then said there were 2 things he remembered, though he wasn't sure whether they were real memories or things he'd invented and later come to believe. The first was the smell of toast in the morning, very close, almost right beside his face. The second was a song. It wasn't music playing on the radio. Someone had been singing, very softly, with the sound of gentle clapping in rhythm. He said he couldn't remember the words, only that the melody rose and then fell again at the end. Adeline raised a hand to her mouth. Then she lowered it and began to sing. She sang softly, the way people sing to a drowsy child. Her voice wasn't beautiful and drifted slightly out of tune on the high note, and she made it through only the first 4 lines before she had to stop and breathe. It was the song their mother used to sing, the one she sang while kneading dough before dawn, the one Adeline had sung to a tiny baby brother lying in a cradle beside the kitchen table, because their mother's hands were busy, and because Adeline loved being praised by the adults for being such a good older sister. Owen Pryor didn't say anything. He turned, walked 3 steps toward the concrete stairs outside the station, and sat down. He sank onto them so suddenly that it was as though the bones had been pulled from his legs. He bowed his head, clasped both hands around the back of his neck, and remained that way for a long time as the sky gradually brightened behind the row of buildings across the street. Adeline didn't approach him. She stayed where she was and let him sit. Another ambulance pulled into the lot with its lights still turning. 2 members of the next shift climbed out, saw their coworker sitting on the steps, and took another way inside without asking any questions. It was a long while before Owen finally looked up. His eyes were red, and he made no effort to hide them. "Is she still alive?" he asked. Adeline shook her head. Owen gave one small nod. Then he patted the empty place beside him on the step, and she walked over and sat down. The brother and sister remained there beside each other in the ambulance station parking lot until the sun had fully risen. They remained on those steps until the entire morning shift had arrived, and Adeline told him about their mother. She told him how Rosalind had worked 3 jobs, how she slept in a chair because if she lay down she couldn't get back up, how she'd fallen ill one summer, and about the day she collapsed inside the laundromat downstairs. Owen had been listening when he suddenly looked up. "Which laundromat?" he asked. Adeline told him the name of the street. Owen said nothing. He stood, rising a little too quickly, and having to steady himself against the wall. Then he told her to wait there, and went inside the station. The station's records room was at the end of the corridor. A small room with several metal filing cabinets, and the smell of damp paper. They kept their call reports by year, 1 drawer for each year, with every drawer arranged by month. Owen pulled one open. He searched through the papers, then went back through them again before sitting on the floor with the entire stack across his lap so he could search faster. His fingers left marks along the edges of the pages, because his hands were damp. He found it in the middle of the stack. It was a pre-printed form filled with tiny boxes and crowded handwriting. The response address was the laundromat on Elmwood Street. The call had been received shortly before 10 o'clock at night. In the box describing the patient's initial condition, a line stated that the patient was a woman who'd collapsed at work, conscious but disoriented, with a weak pulse. And in the box for the patient's full name were 2 words written in blue ink, leaning slightly to the right, written in haste but with every stroke still clear. Rosalind Marsh. The handwriting was his. Owen sat on the records room floor and stared at that name for a very long time. Then he began to remember. He remembered that he'd still been a rookie that night, only a few months into working the night shift, and that his partner had been an older man who was always complaining about something. He remembered the laundromat was still brightly lit, the machines were still turning, and the air smelled of detergent and heat. He remembered the woman lying on her side in the middle of the aisle, her hair more than half gray and 1 slipper missing from her foot. He remembered kneeling beside her and saying the words he'd been trained to say. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand once." And she had squeezed it. He remembered the ambulance jolting over an intersection as he sat beside the stretcher and held her hand in his because her pulse was weak and because she kept searching for something to hold. The skin at the base of her fingers was calloused and dry, and her nails were cut very short. He remembered leaning closer and asking whether she was hurting anywhere. She opened her eyes and looked at him. She studied him for a moment with the gaze of someone struggling to see clearly. Then she spoke. "It's all right, son." He remembered finding it faintly amusing because elderly people often called everyone son. He remembered telling her to save her strength and not to speak anymore. He remembered her hand tightening around his once more before the ambulance turned into the emergency entrance, and he remembered transferring her to the team inside, reading her vital signs aloud, signing the form, then going outside to wash his hands and finish the pastry he'd left in the ambulance because there were still 3 more calls that night. He never knew what happened afterward. No one in that profession ever knew what happened afterward. Adeline went looking for him because he'd been gone too long. She opened the records room door and found her brother sitting on the floor with his back against a metal cabinet, the paper face down across his lap, his shoulders shaking without making a sound. He looked up at her. "I was with Mom," he said. His voice broke completely. "I held her hand the entire way. I even asked if she was in pain. She told me, 'It's all right, son.'" He couldn't speak after that. He handed her the report, and Adeline took it and looked at the 2 words written in blue ink, her mother's name written by the hand of the son Rosalind had signed away before he was old enough to write. Adeline remembered that night. She remembered running from her shift to the hospital, and by the time she arrived, the ambulance was already gone, and only a few plastic chairs remained in the corridor. She'd stood there all night without ever knowing who had just sat beside her mother, who had held her hand on the journey there. "Mom called me son," Owen said. She was right. The silver car parked in front of the laundromat at noon the following day, blocking half the entrance, and the woman who stepped out stood looking at the narrow wooden staircase along the side of the building for a while before deciding to climb it. Camilla Sinclair knocked with her knuckles, 3 times, each knock evenly spaced. Adeline opened the door, and for one brief second, the 2 women simply stood looking at each other through the narrow doorway, one dressed in worn clothes she wore around the house, the other wearing an outfit that cost as much as an entire year's rent. "May I come in?" Camilla asked. Adeline stepped back to let her pass. Camilla entered, and she couldn't hide the fact that her eyes were counting the single-burner hot plate, counting the bed against the wall, counting the places where plaster had peeled from the ceiling. She didn't sit down. She opened her purse, took out a check, and placed it on the small table beside the window, turning it so the writing faced Adeline. "This is from me," she said. "Not from him, and not from my father. From me." Adeline looked at the check, then raised her eyes. She didn't reach for it. "What do you want?" "I want you to take it and stop appearing," Camilla said. Then she fell silent for a moment, and when she continued, her voice had changed. The polished ease of the woman who'd stood before 200 guests was gone. "Do you know that everywhere I've gone this entire week, people have stopped talking when I walk past? At the beauty salon, at church, during the charity luncheon, they don't say anything. They only pause for a moment, then begin talking about something else. You did that with a single sentence." Adeline said she hadn't done anything. Camilla let out a short laugh that held no amusement. "Do you want to know why I threw that glass of wine at you? Because I didn't know who you were. I swear I didn't. I didn't hate you. I hadn't even looked closely at your face." She turned toward the window. "There were 200 people in that room, and I've counted them. Not one of them was there because of me. They came because of the Fiancée name, because of the docs, because of my father's money. The man who's going to marry me signs more papers with my father than he spends time speaking to me. I've never been anyone's first choice in my entire life. Do you understand that? Not even once." She turned back. "Then that night, a waiter spilled wine on my dress, and I looked around, and you were the only person in that entire room I could stand above. That was all. There was no greater reason than that." Adeline remained still for a long time. Then she slowly asked how long Camilla's father had been doing business with a man named Kessler. Camilla blinked. "Why are you asking me that?" "Do you know?" Camilla looked at her. Something passed very quickly through her eyes. It wasn't surprise, but the reflex of someone who'd just touched a door she'd always warned herself never to open. "You think I know?" she said. "I don't know. I've simply been careful to make sure I never have to know." She picked up her purse. When she reached the door, she stopped and turned her head toward the check, still lying untouched on the table, but she didn't take it back. "Leave it there," she said. "I don't want to carry it out of here." Then she descended the staircase, her heels striking each wooden step, and the silver car pulled away from Elmwood Street. That night, in the large house across the city, Camilla Sinclair didn't return to her room. She sat in her father's study with the desk lamp burning until morning. Loretta Nash's shoebox remained on the desk in the second-floor study for the next several days, and Angelo Ferrante opened it every night without knowing what he was searching for inside. He knew how to read contracts and balance sheets, but when he looked at construction payment vouchers from the years when his father was still alive, all he saw were numbers sitting beside one another. He couldn't see what they were saying to each other. On the third day, he called the Human Resources Department and ordered them to find every employment application ever submitted under the name Marsh, including those that had been rejected. He expected nothing to come of it. By afternoon, 3 files were brought upstairs. He opened the first. It contained an application for an assistant accountant position submitted many years earlier, accompanied by a community college transcript with grades so impressive that he had to look twice, and a line in the experience section stating that the applicant was working the night shift at a bakery. In the lower right corner was a rejection stamp, initialed in black ink. He recognized the initials. The second file was nearly identical, submitted about a year and a half later, bearing the same notation and the same initials. He opened the third. This application was more recent, and the paper was still white. It was for the same position, under the same name, with the same rejection stamp in the lower corner. But along the left margin, running down the edge of the page, a handwritten note appeared in blue ink. The writing was slanted and swift, made with a fountain pen. "Hire this woman." Beneath it were 2 initials. Angelo sat before that sheet of paper for a very long time. He knew exactly where the fountain pen filled with blue ink was because it was still lying in the top drawer of the desk where he sat. He tried to remember. He couldn't remember anything. He couldn't remember what day it had been, who had brought the file into his office, or how many lines he'd read before writing those 3 words in the margin. He must have been in a hurry. There must have been a tall stack of papers, with this file buried somewhere in the middle. He must have glanced at the transcript, seen that it was good, written those 3 words, pushed the file aside, moved on to the next page, and never thought of it again for the rest of his life. The rejection stamp had been placed on the application after he'd written his note. He called her that evening and told her to come. When Adeline entered the study, the 3 files had been arranged neatly on the desk. He didn't immediately ask her to sit. He only turned the 3rd file toward her and pushed it across the desk. She looked down. She recognized her own handwriting. Then she saw the blue ink in the margin, read it, and read it again. She said nothing. "I told them to hire you," Angelo said. His voice was lower than usual. "I wrote it down. I simply didn't care enough to ask whether that paper reached the place it was supposed to go. I gave my approval and forgot about it. Someone downstairs stamped it rejected, and I never knew." He paused. "How many years did you lose after submitting this application?" Adeline didn't answer the question. She placed the file on the desk. "Did you call me here only to show me this?" "No." He placed Loretta's shoebox on the desk and pushed it toward her. "There are more than 200 papers in here that I can't read. I've already given them to 2 people, and both told me they couldn't find anything unusual. One of those men is on my payroll, and I no longer trust him." He looked at her. "You studied accounting. You can read them. And you're the only person in this city I know for certain can't be bought, because everything anyone could have bought from you has already been taken away." Adeline silently studied the box. "I'll pay you a salary," he said. "I'm not giving you money. I'm paying you for your work." For all those years, the name Marsh had been the reason people closed her files. This was the first time anyone had hired her because of it. The archive was in the basement of the Fiancée Group's administrative building, a long succession of metal shelves rising higher than a person's head, with fluorescent lights mounted at intervals, and air so dry that it always cracked the lips. Angelo gave her an access card and told her she could work whatever hours she chose. Adeline chose the night because people came down to retrieve files during the day, and she didn't want anyone seeing what she was examining. For the first 2 nights, she only read and took notes. She followed exactly the method her father had taught her when she was still sitting at the kitchen table, watching him check the accounts. "Don't look for the wrong number, sweetheart. People hide wrong numbers too carefully. Look for the name that appears more regularly than it should." On the 3rd night, she found it. Harborline Supply, a material supplier with an address in a row of warehouses near the docks, first appearing in the accounts during the very winter her father was taken away. From that moment onward, there had been a payment voucher bearing that name every month. Not 1 month was missing. Adeline turned to the warehouse receipt files. She searched through them 3 times, then stopped and sat perfectly still. Throughout all those years, there wasn't a single warehouse receipt showing that Harborline Supply had delivered even 1 yard of material. No cement, no steel, no scaffolding, nothing at all. There was only money going out. She opened the corporate registration file. On the 2nd page, in the section naming the legal representative, was a name she'd already seen on the 2 employment applications, stamped rejected: Warren Kessler. She straightened in her chair. Then she pulled out the contract files from the more recent seasons and searched to see who else Harborline had billed besides the Fiancée Group. There was only one name: Hollis Sinclair's Real Estate Corporation. Adeline didn't stand immediately. She sat on the plastic chair between the 2 metal shelves and thought about that morning when a thin layer of snow covered the ground, about the house with the blue painted wooden porch, and about the man standing before the mirror tying his necktie. Then she took out her phone and began photographing the records. She photographed every page slowly and evenly, checking each image to make sure no part of it was blurred. More than 300 pages. When she'd finished, she did something she'd been planning since before she first descended into this basement. She opened her email, sent everything to the address belonging to the second-hand shop in Pawtucket, and added a short message for Loretta Nash. "Please keep these for me. Don't open them. And don't tell anyone." She did it because her mother had spent the rest of her life living with what happened after someone took away her father's records, and because in Adeline's family, they'd learned that anything with only 1 copy was the same as having no copy at all. She pressed send shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning. At that exact moment, the row of lights in the corridor outside the archive came on. Adeline turned off her phone screen and pressed herself into the darkness between 2 metal shelves. She heard a key. The archive door opened, and light from the corridor spilled across the concrete floor in a long strip, stopping about 3 steps from where she stood. She heard footsteps. The person walked halfway down the aisle. then stopped. Adeline heard a metal drawer being pulled open and closed again. Then the footsteps turned back toward the door. The phone in her hand gave a faint vibration, warning her that the battery was low, and its screen suddenly flared to life in the darkness. She pressed it face down against her stomach, her heart beating so violently that she could hear it in her ears. The footsteps stopped. Silence held for several breaths. Then a voice spoke, not loudly, but with the easy familiarity of someone talking to a coworker during a lunch break. "If anyone's still down here, remember to turn off the lights for me." The archive door closed. The key turned in the lock. The corridor lights went out. Adeline remained exactly where she was for a very long time, far longer than necessary, until her legs stopped trembling. That same night, at the house on the hill, Angelo Ferrante's phone lit up on the desk. The call came from a number he knew very well, a number used only when the council wanted to remind him how many days he had left. He watched it vibrate until it fell silent on its own, then turned it face down on the desk and didn't call back. The following morning, Adeline was walking along the third-floor corridor toward the temporary office they'd arranged for her when she saw a man standing beside the coffee machine, waiting for his cup to fill. He wore a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, and when he saw her, he smiled before speaking. "You're Miss Marsh, aren't you? I've been meaning to come downstairs and introduce myself for the past few days, but I've been too busy." He took out a second cup, set it beneath the machine, pressed the button, then pushed it toward her when it was full. "Drink it. This machine makes decent coffee, unlike the one on the first floor." Adeline accepted the cup but didn't drink. Warren Kessler leaned against the wall and stirred his coffee with a small wooden stick, taking his time like a man who had the entire morning to spare. "I knew your father," he said. "We sat with exactly one partition between us. He used to bring sandwiches his wife made for his lunch, while I always bought mine from the cafe. He kept telling me I was wasting money." He laughed softly, the laugh of someone recalling a pleasant memory. "A good man. Truly, a very good man. The only trouble is that people who are too good often make life difficult for themselves, if you understand what I mean. Some things will pass on their own if you leave them alone. If you insist on standing in their way, you'll only end up getting wet." He took a sip. "You're very good at reading accounts, from what I've heard, just like him." He said nothing more. As he passed her, he merely gave her shoulder a gentle pat, told her to knock on his office door if she needed anything, then disappeared around the bend in the corridor. Adeline continued to her office, placed the cup of coffee on the desk, pulled out the chair, and sat down. When she reached for the file, she saw that her fingers were trembling. That afternoon, she told them what had happened in the second-floor study. After listening, Angelo stood and walked to the window without saying anything. It was Bruno Tedesco who spoke. He set down the tea tray, then sat fully in one of the chairs, something he'd never done in that room throughout all his years in the house. "Young master," he said, "there's something I should have told you a long time ago." He explained that the former owner had tried once. One summer, he'd summoned Kessler to this room and closed the door. Bruno had stood in the corridor outside, so he couldn't hear what was said. He only heard the two men speaking very quietly for more than an hour. Kessler emerged with an ordinary expression on his face, and even greeted Bruno at the top of the stairs. "The following morning," Bruno said, "someone left an envelope outside the front door. There was no stamp and no name of the sender. I was the one who found it and carried it inside to the owner. It contained copies from a file. Not the entire file, only several pages, but enough to make it clear that there was more. Those pages recorded payments that had passed through the material supply company, and at the bottom of every page, in the approval box, was Salvatore Ferrante's signature. He really did sign them," Bruno said. "He signed hundreds of papers every month. Whenever they brought him documents, he signed them, but the papers don't know how to explain that." Kessler had deposited the complete file with a law office, along with instructions that if he died, disappeared, or anything unusual happened to him, the entire file was to be sent out. One copy to the Ardolino family, one copy to the prosecutor's office. From that day forward, the owner never mentioned that name again, Bruno said. He still sat at the same table with him once every week. You remember, don't you? When you were a child, the house was always full on Sunday nights. Angelo remained standing with his back to them. "That file?" he asked. "Does it still exist?" "I have no reason to believe it's gone," Bruno said. Bruno withdrew after saying those words, leaving only two people in the room. Angelo remained at the window with his back to the door, both hands braced against the sill, and he stood there so long that Adeline thought he wasn't going to speak again. Then he turned around. "There's something," he said, "that I won't be able to say at all if I don't say it now." He returned to the chair behind his desk and placed both hands on the wooden surface, looking down at them. He told her that during that winter, he'd still been in high school, at the age when the most important thing in the world was having adults believe you were already a man. One evening, his father summoned him to this study, the very room where they were sitting now. A thick yellow envelope lay sealed on the desk. His father told him to put on a warm coat, then handed him the envelope and said, "Take this to Uncle Warren's house. Put it directly into his hands. Don't give it to anyone else." Angelo asked whether he needed to say anything. His father said yes. "Tell him only one sentence." "My father says he agrees." Bruno drove him there. Angelo remembered how cold it was that night, so cold that all the windows of the car had fogged over, and he'd used his sleeve to wipe a circle clear so he could see outside. He remembered the house with several red brick steps and a small evergreen tree wrapped in lights in the yard because it was almost Christmas. He remembered the man who opened the door wearing a sweater and holding a newspaper. The man smiled at him, asked whether he was cold, and if he wanted to come inside for something warm to drink. Angelo said no. He had to return home. Then, he held out the envelope and repeated exactly what his father had instructed him to say, speaking clearly because he'd rehearsed the sentence throughout the entire drive and didn't want to stumble over it. "My father says he agrees." The man accepted the envelope with both hands. He didn't open it. He merely nodded, patted Angelo on the shoulder, and told him he was a good boy and that he was just like his father. On the way home, Angelo sat in the back seat feeling happy. He was genuinely happy. It was the first time his father had entrusted him with something that wasn't an ordinary household errand. The first time there had been a sentence only he was allowed to deliver, and he hadn't gotten a single word wrong. He remembered asking Bruno, "Did I say it right?" Bruno had only murmured yes without turning his head. When they returned home, his father was still sitting in the study. Angelo went inside and reported that he'd delivered the envelope and said the words. His father looked at him for a long time, then pulled him close and embraced him, holding him more tightly and much longer than usual. And Angelo didn't understand why. He only remembered asking his father one question before going to bed. "When will you let me go with you again?" Angelo stopped there. He was still looking down at his hands on the desk. "He didn't answer me," he said. "And he never sent me anywhere again. Not until the day he died." Adeline sat perfectly still. She didn't ask what day it had been. She didn't need to. She'd read the dates on the payment vouchers in Loretta's shoebox enough times to know which events belonged to which period, and that winter had been the winter of thin snow, the winter when someone knocked on the door while her father was tying his necktie before the mirror. "I didn't know what was inside that envelope," Angelo said. "I swear to you that I didn't know, but I was the one who carried it there. Mine was the hand that gave it to him, and I was happy to do it." He raised his eyes to her for the first time since he'd begun telling the story. "You have the right to know who brought it to his door. It wasn't Kessler. Kessler wrote the paper. I was the one who delivered it." Adeline said nothing. She rose from the chair. She picked up the coat, draped over its back, and folded it across her arm slowly and carefully, exactly the way she always arranged things in a kitchen at the end of a shift. Then she walked to the door. Angelo didn't call her back. He remained where he was, listening to her footsteps carry her along the entire corridor, down the full length of the staircase, and then to the sound of the great door closing on the floor below. She kept going to work. It was the only thing she knew how to do when there was something inside her that she couldn't put into order, and in any case, she hadn't finished reading the files in the shoebox, and her father was still buried beneath the name people had given him. That night, she stayed later than usual, and by the time she reached the underground garage, the clock on the wall showed that it was past 11 o'clock. Only 3 cars remained on the entire level. Hers was parked near the exit, the old car she'd managed to reclaim after receiving her first month's salary. She unlocked it, placed her cloth bag on the passenger seat, and had just settled behind the wheel when headlights swept across the car from behind. A dark vehicle approached slowly, then stopped directly behind her. She looked into the rearview mirror. Then a second vehicle emerged from the turn on the other side, moving just as slowly, and stopped across the space in front of her. Adeline didn't start the engine. She sat still with both hands resting on the steering wheel. No one sounded a horn. No one turned on the hazard lights. The garage was so silent that she could clearly hear the ventilation fan running somewhere above the ceiling. The door of the car behind her opened, and a man stepped out. He was in no hurry. He walked around to the passenger side, bent down to look through the window, then tapped twice on the glass with his knuckles. The knocks were gentle, with the familiar rhythm of someone tapping on a neighbor's door. Adeline didn't open it. The man tried the handle. That door wasn't locked, because she'd just placed her bag inside and hadn't yet pressed the central locking button. He opened it without speaking to her or looking at her, reached inside, took the cloth bag from the passenger seat, then closed the door as gently as he'd opened it. He began walking back toward his vehicle. After several steps, he spoke without turning around. "Go home and get some sleep, Miss Marsh." The two vehicles moved away, one reversing out and the other driving straight ahead, and in less than a minute, the garage was empty again. Adeline remained where she was for a very long time. Inside that cloth bag were her notes, the small hard drive onto which she'd copied every photograph, and the pen she'd been using since she was a student. She raised a hand to her face and held it there for a while. Then, she took out her phone, opened her sent messages, and saw that the email she'd sent to Pawtucket was still there, successfully delivered with more than 300 attachments. She lowered the phone to her lap and laughed, a very brief sound that was almost no more than a breath. The following day, Angelo Ferrante called Camilla Sinclair and told her that the engagement would be postponed indefinitely. He offered no explanation. By afternoon, 2 long-term cargo handling contracts at the Allens Avenue docks had been withdrawn by their partners, both citing adjustments to their quarterly plans. By evening, the counsel's number called again, and this time, he answered. The person on the other end spoke briefly, telling him that the old deadline no longer applied and that he now had until the end of the month. He'd barely put down the phone when it rang again. Hollis Sinclair didn't bother to greet him. "Do you know what you've just done?" he said. "You've traded that entire harbor for a girl who delivers food." Angelo stood beside the window, looking down the slope leading to the main road. "No," he said. "I traded it for the right to look at myself in the mirror tomorrow morning." Warren Kessler waited for Owen Pryor in the ambulance station parking lot at the end of the afternoon shift. Standing beside his car, with the patience of a man who could remain there for an hour if necessary. He knew where Owen's adoptive mother was being treated. He knew how much her next course of medication would cost, and he knew whom Owen had approached for a loan. He mentioned all of it naturally, slipping the details between ordinary questions about how Owen was doing, then opened his briefcase and took out 2 sheets of paper. The first was a check. The second was a prepared typed statement in large, easily readable print, declaring that the person signing it confirmed that his sister had copied internal Ferrante Group documents and removed them without authorization. "You don't have to tell a single lie," Kessler said. "She did photograph those documents, didn't she? You're only confirming what actually happened." He placed both sheets on the hood of Owen's car, laid a pen on top of them, then climbed into his own vehicle and drove away without saying a single word to pressure him. Owen sat inside his car with the 2 papers across his lap. The sky gradually darkened. The parking lot lights came on. He held the pen, turned it between his fingers, put it down, then picked it up again. He thought about the woman who'd taken him into her home before he was old enough to speak. The woman who'd sat in the front row when he received his certification and applauded louder than anyone else. The woman who now lay on the 4th floor of the hospital and kept asking him, "You can manage the money for the medicine, can't you, sweetheart?" He thought about the call report bearing the 3 words written in blue ink. He sat in the car for a very long time. Then he started the engine and drove straight to Elmwood Street. Adeline opened the door and found her brother standing there, holding 2 sheets of paper with crumpled edges. He came inside, placed the check on the small table beside the window, and stood looking at it. "I almost sold you for a second time," he said. "The first time, I didn't get to choose. I was too young, so someone signed the papers for me. This time, I did have a choice." He looked up, "And I choose you." Adeline couldn't speak. She only stepped forward and embraced him. And because he stood a full head taller than she did, he had to bend down. That evening, they took both papers to the house on the hill. Bruno Tedesco answered the door. He looked at Adeline and greeted her with a nod, then turned toward the young man standing behind her. He froze. He stared for so long that Owen became uncomfortable and asked whether something was wrong. Bruno didn't answer him. He turned toward the interior of the house and called for the young master to come downstairs, using a voice Owen had never heard from him before. Angelo reached the foot of the staircase and stopped. Bruno pointed toward the young man wearing an emergency medical jacket. "Young master," he said, "look carefully." Angelo looked. He studied Owen for a moment, and then his entire body became still in the way of someone who'd just had a bucket of cold water thrown over him. The night on the Point Street Bridge, the night he could now remember only in scattered fragments. He remembered metal grinding against the road. He remembered lying on his side inside the vehicle, unable to lift his arm. He remembered lights sweeping past, then someone reaching inside to pull him out and holding his head straight. And he remembered a very young man's voice speaking into his ear over and over. "Sir, look at me. Don't close your eyes. Keep talking to me." Angelo had never known the man's face. The hospital had only told him which unit had brought him in. He'd ordered someone to investigate, and they reported that one member of the crew that night had been a young trainee studying for his advanced certification who couldn't afford the tuition. Angelo told them to pay it for him, discreetly, for 2 consecutive terms. He instructed them not to let anyone discover who'd paid, and he'd never once asked the young man's name. Angelo raised a hand and touched the thin scar running along his jaw. "It was you," he said. His voice broke between the words. Owen didn't understand what was happening. Adeline placed the 2 papers on the table and told them everything. Angelo looked at the check, then at the prepared statement, and finally at the young man standing before him. "One of my own men just tried to buy the person who pulled me out of that car," he said. Bruno Tedesco had been leaning against the doorframe the entire time, and when Angelo finished speaking, he released his grip on the frame and walked several steps into the center of the room. He moved slowly, then he stopped before Adeline and lowered himself to his knees. It was difficult for him. He braced one hand against the table as he descended, and both Owen and Angelo stepped forward to help, but Bruno raised a hand to stop them. "Let me finish first," he said. He told them that on that thinly snowed winter night, he'd been the driver who took the boy to deliver the yellow envelope. He'd parked about 30 feet from the man's house and sat inside the car with the heater running, watching the boy climb out, walk up the red brick steps, and knock on the door. He saw the door open, saw the light from inside spill across the steps, and saw the boy offer the envelope with both hands, exactly as he'd been taught. "I knew what was inside," Bruno said. "I didn't know every word with certainty, but I'd worked in that house long enough to know what was being decided that week, and I knew whose name had been spoken in the study throughout that entire month." He looked up at Angelo. "I sat inside that car and let a child carry it up those steps for me, because if I'd held it in my own hands, I would have had to admit that I knew what I was carrying. But if the boy carried it, then I was only the driver." Then he turned toward Adeline. He said that after her father was taken away, her mother had come to the gates of that house. The first time was in the morning. She wore an old coat and stood outside the iron gates, saying that she needed to see Mr. Fiancée for only 5 minutes because she had something to tell him about her husband. Bruno went to the gate and told her the owner wasn't home. The owner was home. The second time was late in the afternoon, several weeks later. That time, she brought a stack of papers inside a plastic bag and said she only needed to show them to him. As soon as she'd done that, she would leave. Bruno told her the owner was receiving guests. He closed the gate and returned to the house without telling anyone that someone had come. The third time was during the following winter. She stood outside for a very long time because cold rain was falling that day, and when Bruno came out, she no longer asked to see anyone. She only asked him one question. Who inside this house kept the old records? Bruno said he didn't know, then closed the gate for the third time. She left, he said, and I went back inside, sat down in the kitchen, and couldn't eat my dinner that night. Then, several months later, I went looking for her myself. He explained that he was the one who'd hired her as a housekeeper in that house. He'd signed the papers, entered her under her maiden name, and assigned her to the late afternoon cleaning shift so she would have less contact with the people upstairs. He didn't tell the owner. He didn't tell anyone. He did it because he couldn't live with having closed those gates 3 times, and he thought that if he opened another door for her, perhaps the weight of those 3 times would become easier to bear. She worked there for 2 years, Bruno said. She scrubbed floors, washed linens, and was the last person to leave every night. I knew what she was searching for. I didn't help her, but I didn't stop her either. Then someone in the Human Resources Department discovered that the name on her employment papers didn't match the name in her tax records. The order to dismiss her came down that morning, and Bruno was the one assigned to tell her. "I walked her all the way to the gate," he said. "She didn't blame me for anything. She only thanked me for those 2 years." He lowered his head. "Last Saturday night, when you were standing outside the service entrance waiting to come in, I looked at your face and knew immediately whose daughter you were. I knew before you ever said your surname in the corridor. And still, I opened the door and let you enter. Because I've been a coward for too long, Miss Marsh. So long that cowardice became a habit." No one in the room moved. Owen turned his face away. Angelo stood at the foot of the staircase with his arms hanging at his sides, unable to look toward Adeline. Adeline stepped forward. She bent down, slid both hands beneath the old man's arms, and helped him to his feet. He was heavier than she'd expected, so it took some time. She pulled a chair closer and helped him sit. Then she straightened and spoke to him, but loudly enough for the man at the foot of the staircase to hear. "You closed the gate because you were afraid." He carried that envelope because he was still a child and believed he was doing something good for his father. "My mother remained silent for the rest of her life because she loved her children." She paused. "All 3 of you did wrong, but only one person ate well and slept soundly throughout all those years because of it. And that person isn't either of the 2 men standing in this room." Loretta Nash came to Elmwood Street the following morning carrying the shoebox, and she asked Adeline to let her examine the envelope again. She took it to the window, tilted it back and forth beneath the light, then put on her reading glasses. "No one drew this," she said. "It's a watermark. I remember it because I had an account there back then, at that little credit union near the docks. It closed a long time ago. The lighthouse was their mark. This is a bank envelope, Adeline, not an ordinary one." She turned it over, examined the sealed edge, then told Adeline to turn it inside out. Adeline slipped her fingers inside and pulled the 2 layers of paper apart. At the bottom, secured inside the fold with a piece of yellowed tape, was a small, flat brass key with a number stamped into its surface. No one spoke for a while. Then Loretta sat down and raised a hand to her mouth. "Dear God, Rosalind," she said. 2 days later, the bank that had taken over the old credit union's accounts found the records. The safe deposit box was still active. Its maintenance fees had been paid regularly year after year by money order, every payment made on time, until the final one, which had been paid only a few weeks before Rosalind collapsed in the laundromat. The annual amount was very small, but Adeline knew exactly how little her family had possessed during those years, and she knew where that small payment had been taken from. The bank employee opened the first lock, and Adeline inserted her key into the second. Inside the long, narrow box was a single transparent cellophane sleeve containing 2 sheets of paper. The first was the original payroll page, whose photocopy Adeline had been holding in her hands for so many days. The paper was genuine, the ink was genuine, and the seal was genuine. The 2 altered lines were still there, with the ink written over them even clearer than it had appeared in the copy. The second sheet was the accompanying acknowledgement form, bearing the original signature of the person who'd prepared the payroll and the original signature of the person who'd approved the payment. Loretta lifted the 2 pages, but her hands trembled so badly that she had to place them on the table again. "She found it," Loretta said. She truly found it. During those 2 years she spent cleaning that house, she found this paper. Adeline stood staring at the 2 pages, and she understood something she'd never considered throughout all those years. Her mother hadn't lost. Her mother had won. She'd won long ago, on the night she carried that paper out of the house on the hill. She'd simply never dared to use it. She placed it in a safe deposit box and paid the fee year after year with money that should have bought food because she'd already lost a husband, had already signed away a son, and knew exactly what she would lose next if she brought that paper into the light. She guarded it for the rest of her life, waiting for a day she didn't live long enough to see. That night, at the house on the hill, Bruno Tedesco stood in the doorway of the study and watched the young master put on his coat. "Young master," he said quietly, "the deadline is tomorrow." Angelo fastened the final button. "I know," he said. Then he left. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Warren Kessler came downstairs to the kitchen and turned on the light. He stopped abruptly at the foot of the stairs. Angelo Ferrante was sitting in Kessler's living room, in the armchair beside the window, still wearing his coat. 3 neatly stacked files rested on the coffee table before him. Angelo didn't rise. He merely tilted his chin toward the table. The top file contained the ownership papers for the house in which Kessler was standing. The second contained a complete inventory of his property, accounts, shares, and everything Kessler believed no one else knew in full. The third contained Harborline Supply's registration records, with the name of its legal representative printed in bold on the second page. Kessler stared at the 3 files for a long time. Then, his voice still retaining its old familiarity, he said, "You do know that I left a file with a lawyer, don't you?" "I know," Angelo said. "Leave it there. I'll answer for my father's part, but what I came here to give you has nothing to do with that." He stood and adjusted the collar of his coat. "I'm giving you what you never gave Thomas Marsh. I'm giving you a choice. This morning, you can go there yourself and confess. Or you can remain in this city and live among the very people whose money you've been taking all these years. I won't need to do anything. I'll simply stop speaking when people ask me about you." He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and glanced back at the pot of coffee brewing in the kitchen. "Your coffee is too weak," he said. "Tell her to add another spoonful." Warren Kessler didn't go there. He arrived in the great hall of the house on the hill at precisely the appointed time, clean-shaven, his necktie straight, and shook hands with each person at the door as he always did. The same guests were there, the same round tables, except that today a small platform had been placed at the front of the room, and a leather-bound file was waiting on it. He stepped onto the platform, thanked everyone for coming, and said that today marked a memorable occasion for 2 families, that the merger agreement between the Ferrante Group and the Sinclair Families Corporation would be signed immediately after the announcement. He opened the file. Angelo Ferrante rose from the head table. "Before you read," he said, "I'd like to invite someone to speak." The door at the far end of the room opened. Adeline Marsh entered wearing no uniform at all, only a simple shirt, with a file tucked beneath her arm. Whispers traveled swiftly through the room because at least half the people seated there had been in this hall on that Saturday night. She walked to the platform, placed the file down, and didn't look toward anyone. She didn't make a single accusation. She did exactly the work her father had done throughout his life. She read the numbers. She spoke about a material supplier named Harborline Supply, which had first appeared in the company's accounts during a particular winter, and how payment vouchers had been issued to it every month ever since. She read the total amount of money that had gone out during each period. Then she opened the warehouse receipt file and told the entire room that throughout all those years, there wasn't a single receipt showing that the supplier had delivered even 1 yard of material. She turned to the corporate registration page and read the name of its legal representative. Then, she read the name of the company's only remaining client during the most recent seasons. At the front table, Hollis Sinclair set down his glass. In the row of chairs behind him, an elderly woman stood. "If you need someone to testify to those numbers," Loretta Nash said. "I was the person who prepared the payroll at that construction site. I kept copies throughout all those years. I waited and waited, but no one ever came to ask me." Kessler said these were merely inferences drawn from old documents, and that the man who'd confessed in the case had been dead for many years. Adeline removed 2 sheets of paper from the file and placed them on the platform. "This is the original complaint submitted to the State Department of Labor that summer," she said, "and this is the version you read in the newspaper." She allowed the room to remain silent for a moment. The signature at the bottom of both documents is the same stroke, the same pressure against the paper. But the contents aren't. The original was a formal accusation. My father wrote it. My father signed it. My father was the man who came forward to expose the theft of the Worker Safety Fund at his own construction site. She placed one hand on the paper. That complaint never reached the place where it was supposed to go. It was intercepted along the way. The signature was left untouched, while the contents were rewritten. They turned an accusation into a confession. She raised her eyes and looked across the room. My father wasn't destroyed because he was weak. My father was destroyed because he was the only person in that building brave enough to put his own name on a piece of paper. No one in the Great Hall said anything. Then Angelo stepped onto the platform. Beside those 2 documents, he placed a third, found at the bottom of the old safe on the 2nd floor. Handwritten, signed, dated, and never sent. He read the final 3 lines, written in a hand far more unsteady than the rest. "I know I must send this. I've sat at this desk for many nights, but there is a son in my house, while the other man has nothing left to lose. So I choose my son, and I know what I'm choosing." Angelo folded the paper. His lawyer, seated at the table beside the platform, had risen and was quietly shaking his head at him. Angelo didn't look at him. "There's one more thing," he told the entire room. "The envelope delivered to Mr. Kessler's house that winter was carried to his door by me. I wasn't old enough to understand, but I was the one who held it in my hands. I'm saying that here, before all of you, and I'll repeat these exact words to anyone who asks me." At the front table, Camilla Sinclair rose. She walked to the platform and placed before Adeline a thick stack of papers printed from her father's email account, with every relevant passage already marked. Then she removed the ring from her left hand, set it on the table beside the papers, and didn't say a single word to anyone. Warren Kessler stepped down from the platform and walked toward the door. 2 men in plain clothes were waiting in the foyer. He stopped before them, listened until they'd finished speaking, then placed his leather briefcase on the floor and held out both hands. The Council of Families didn't grant him a single additional day. By the end of the month, Angelo Ferrante had lost the Allens Avenue docks, along with the position his father had spent a lifetime building, and from that moment forward, the Ferrante name was no longer spoken at the head of the table in the basement rooms of restaurants on Atwells Avenue. But the docks didn't fall into the hands of the Ardolino family. After compensation was set aside for the 3 workers injured all those years ago, and for their families, Angelo used the money recovered from the funds that had passed through Harborline Supply to sell the docks to a cooperative formed by the people who worked there loading and unloading cargo. He sold it at a loss, with the price to be paid in installments over many years. More than 400 people kept their jobs. He lost everything that had given power to the name he carried, and he preserved exactly one thing. Thomas Marsh's case was reviewed. The local newspaper that had condemned him all those years ago printed a correction on the same page where the old headline had appeared. And Adeline bought 3 copies from the newsstand at the end of Elmwood Street, her hand trembling so badly as she held out the change that the vendor had to count it for her. The following spring, the Roslyn Foundation opened in a 2-story house near the docks. The ground floor was a reading room, furnished with low tables and small chairs, its walls painted pale yellow, and every afternoon it filled with the sound of children. They came after school, received books to take home, were given lunch on weekends, and every child had a library card printed with their own name. They laughed constantly and ran everywhere. And the woman overseeing the reading room was an elderly second-hand shop owner from Pawtucket, who'd closed her store and brought her old yellow cat with her. The cat now slept on the reading room windowsill and allowed the children to stroke its back. Upstairs, every Tuesday evening, Owen Pryor taught a free first aid class for people in the neighborhood, showing them how to perform chest compressions, how to call an ambulance, and how to remain calm while they waited. The class was always full. Adeline continued living in the room above the laundromat. People repeatedly asked why she didn't move, and she only said she wanted to keep the place that reminded her where she'd begun. One afternoon in late autumn, the brother and sister climbed to the cemetery on the hillside. Adeline laid down a bouquet, then took the newspaper containing the correction from her bag, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the flowers, weighing it down with a small stone so it wouldn't blow away. Owen knelt and cleaned the headstone with his handkerchief. No one spoke for a long while. Behind them, standing some distance away, Bruno Tedesco removed his hat and held it in his hands. He spoke softly to a man who'd been gone for many years. "Sir, someone finally spoke the truth for you." When they reached the foot of the hill, Angelo was waiting there. He hadn't gone up. He handed Adeline a key and told her it belonged to the office on the 2nd floor of the foundation, her office, and that from that day forward, no one inside that building would ever be permitted to speak to another person in the tone she'd been forced to hear in the great hall that night. Adeline accepted the key. She thanked him. Then the 3 of them walked together toward the main road. No one said anything more, and that was enough. On that Saturday night, when wine ran down her face before 200 people, Adeline had said that her dress would dry, but what had been thrown away couldn't be recovered. At the time, she'd been speaking about her own dignity. Now she understood that those words carried a far greater meaning. Some things, once thrown away, are lost forever. A father, a home, the years when a brother and sister should have grown up beside each other. But there are other things that remain intact no matter how deeply they're buried, or how many years they're left untouched, waiting inside a small, safe deposit box for someone brave enough to open it. A person's dignity doesn't reside in the uniform they wear. The way we treat the person serving us is the truest portrait of who we are. The truth arriving late is still better than the truth never arriving at all, and it came only because one woman had carried an old piece of paper throughout her entire life without ever expecting to witness the day when it finally spoke. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so that together we can hear more meaningful stories every day. How did today's story make you feel? Please leave a few words in the comments. We truly want to hear the thoughts held deepest in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.